Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to our LinkedIn Live with a special guest, Mark Wootton. We'll get onto some introductions in a minute. But yeah, we're going to cover today who is leading customer experience services in Europe. And so really excited about this topic. It's an area that we've covered for many years and got some pretty good experience on. So hopefully the people who've attended today can get some interesting lessons. First of all, just a little bit of housekeeping. Be great to hear where people are based. So if you can put in the comments where you're watching from, that would be brilliant because it helps us understand how broad the audience is, but it's also quite good because sometimes then we can answer some specific questions once we know where people are based, and we can target some of the discussion points. So really looking forward to an interesting discussion throughout the 30-40 minutes, however long this session goes for. Also, if you've got any questions at any point, please put it in the comment section and we'll do our best to answer them. And then the harder questions, the better. I'd love to give Mark and Sharang some challenges, so please come up with some really good, tough questions. So just a quick introduction from me, first of all. So I'm David Rickard. I'm a Vice President at Everest Group. One of the areas that I lead is our customer experience management area. I've been working in contact center and customer experience for probably nearly 20 years now. Been with Everest Group a couple of years, also worked in consulting for a couple of years. And then I worked with Mark at Microsoft for a long time. I was at Microsoft for nearly 17 years. So we've got quite a lot of history together. So that's my background. Sharang, could you just do a brief introduction?
Sure, David. Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Sharan Sharma. I'm a practice director with Everest Group, and I look after our customer experience management research along with David. I've been in this organization for 7 years, where I've been tracking the contact center outsourcing market, and I'm based out of New Delhi, India.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sharang. So also get on to Mark. So when we were looking at doing this session, we wanted to cover the CXM market in Emea because we've recently released our peak that we'll be talking about. And we wanted to really have someone from the industry who's got experience in actually working in EMEA, delivering in EMEA, finding providers in EMEA. And so I thought the best person I could find was Mark, who I know has got a lot of experience working in this area. When I first met him many years ago, he was leading a team who were focused on EMEA and looking to do supplier consolidation within region, etc. So a perfect candidate to bring today. So Mark, hopefully I've paid for your attendance by giving you lots and lots of kudos here and talking about how clever you are. And please don't let us down through the course of this session by proving that you're not. But maybe, yeah, if you could just give us a brief introduction, that would be great.
That was a way nicer introduction than I expected, Dave. Thanks.
There you go.
Great to be with you all. Terrific to see so many folks I've known and worked with over many years on the call or subscribe to join the call as well. I'm lucky enough to have many great people in my team over the years, and I have to say that included Dave. So yeah, I'm giving the compliment back, Dave, but it was always great to have you back in the team as well. So is my check in the post at some point, Dave, for that? I hope so.
Yeah, of course it is.
For those on the call I haven't met, just quick bit of background. Dave's sort of painted it anyway. I just concluded nearly 28 years at Microsoft. And I was, during that time, fortunate enough to lead some outstanding teams that drove some great results. And I think we had a bit of fun along the way too. But especially relevant for this call, I held responsibility for initially UK contact center outsourcing for Microsoft's customer services support. Then moved on to leading this for EMEA for several years. And then for about 8 years, I was proud to be the global leader for all the customer service support contact center business in Microsoft. There's too many highlights and initiatives to call out. I won't bore you with all of that, but a key feature was our regional and global supplier and site consolidation work that we did. The largest of which won an IOP award for global excellence in outsourcing. We were very proud of that, and a fantastic team effort that was. I've also held responsibility for the worldwide Microsoft supplier program and for Microsoft's strategic supplier management team within procurement. Bringing you right up to date very quickly, I decided to have a bit of a break, frankly. It was time, recharge the batteries, take on some new challenges. So I decided to move on from Microsoft a few months ago. So I've had some family time. Then now, just after that, I've just recently set myself up as a consultant and as a member of the Sims Group, consulting group in the US, which is a new consultancy comprising some highly experienced senior leaders I'm proud to be connected with. So if you do want to chat further after this call, feel free to connect with me. If you're not connected in LinkedIn, and contact me via them. That's, I think, as much as I should share, Dave. It'd be a bit boring otherwise.
No, thanks, Mark. And yeah, and when Mark says take a break, what he meant was he played a lot of golf just so he could beat me when we play, because we still meet up every couple of months and have a game of golf. But I am pleased to say the last time we played each other. I did manage to win. So
You did say.
I don't like to brag, but I managed to beat him, even though he's been practicing solidly for the last 3 months. So we've got some really good attendance here. Actually, so some of the highlights here, just looking through the people that are attending. Number from the US, which is great, but we've also got Ghana, we've got Manila, we've got Sweden, Portugal, the Netherlands, Romania, Bucharest. So actually a really great cross section of the audience, actually, and a lot of people from EMEA, which is great because it's an EMEA topic, but we know this is also interesting to our global audience as well. So thank you all for attending. And as I said, please, if you've got any questions, please just drop them in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them as we go through. So we'll get into the content. So we know that the EMEA market is a tough market to serve. It's a complex market. It's got a lot of requirements in terms of language. It's got a really hard market in terms of some of the labour laws that we're working in. So we know, having worked in it, especially say Mark and I, we've been in it a long time. It's a market that is tough to serve. And what we've done for many years at Everest Group is that we focused our peak matrix process that you've probably all seen. If you're on this LinkedIn Live, you probably know a little bit about Everest Group. We have an Emea CXM peak. So this is a process that we go through every year, and it gives us a chance to showcase in the market who the providers are that are delivering in this market and are able to serve the buyers for this space. And we look at aspirants, and we look at major contenders, and we look at leaders. And if we could bring up the slides, I think that one of the things that would be good to do is, Sharang, maybe you can just take us through in terms of when we do the peak, just because, again, we'll have people who maybe not so familiar with a peak. Maybe when we do the peak, what are we looking at? And then we'll get into actually what was the result from the peak this year.
Sure, David. Happy to. So what you're seeing on the screen right now is the methodology that we use for the assessment. And this box that you see in the center is where we typically position service providers across three categories: aspirants, major contenders, and leaders. Now, how we position this again is a very comprehensive analysis. So on the y-axis, what you see is the market impact, which is essentially trying to measure the kind of impact a service provider has been able to create in the market. In this context, it would be the EMEA market. And we capture that through three sub-dimensions. The first one being market adoption, which reflects the kind of success that the service provider has had. So things like number of clients, the revenue that the service provider has in the region, year-on-year growth in clientele and in the number in the revenue, as well as we look at the deal value and volume as well. The next is portfolio mix, which essentially tries to understand how well is the service provider positioned to service different kind of service providers, different kind of enterprises. So this would look at the geographic breadth and depth. So how well is it spread across different regions within EMEA? Industrial breadth and depth, so across different industries like manufacturing, telecom, banking, technology, and others, and as well as also different kind of buyer sizes. So we understand that typically a small buyer would have a very different requirement from a large multinational client. So any service provider who has that capability to service different kinds of buyers in the market, that obviously is looked at favorably. And then we have value delivered, which essentially is our way of capturing what the buyers of the service providers are saying about them. So typically we collect that kind of buyer feedback on how their performance is, how do they see them doing as they're engaging with them, and collect that and use that for assessment as well. On the x-axis, what we have is what we call as vision and capability, which essentially measures the capability of a service provider to deliver on the requirements that their enterprise clients might have. Again, there are four sub-dimensions here. So we look at vision and strategy, which entails essentially what is the vision for CX that the service provider has, both for itself, so how does it see meeting the changing requirements in the market, and what is the vision that it has for its clients, right? So I mean, yes, in a lot of cases, what we see that clients like to drive that kind of vision for themselves, but in many cases, they also seek that kind of support from service providers, and that is what we look for. Next is scope of services, which looks at how well is the service provider positioned to meet different kind of requirements that enterprises may have. These could be requirements across different languages, and we know how Europe is with so many languages, different kind of processes, so customer service, tech support, sales, and whatnot, as well as different kind of channels. So we understand that non-voice is a rapidly growing channel in Europe, with channels like email, chat, and social media on the rise. So having that kind of experience to serve on those channels is also important. Next, we look at technology and innovation, and we understand that a lot of enterprises are now focusing on that whole digital transformation route that they've taken themselves on. And here we look at their technology capabilities. So things like, how well they are positioned to serve the automation, analytics, omnichannel, cloud requirements that typically enterprises have on the CX side, as well as what are the next gen innovative things that they're bringing outside technology as well. So next gen pricing models like outcome based pricing, consulting and advisory services that they offer on the CX front. All of those that go into this dimension. And then finally, we have delivery footprint. Again, we see a lot of varied requirement coming in from clients from the EMEA region, where they require a mix of onshore, nearshore in Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Africa as well, and off late as well as remote capability, be it through work at home model or gig CX delivery model. So all of that and the capability and the flexibility of the service provider to offer these kind of different requirements, that sort of gets assessed in the delivery footprint. So all of this, we take scores across all of these subdimensions and plot them on the peak matrix. And what we have on the next slide is how we have assessed service providers in the EMEA region for this year.
Yeah,
So again,
and Sharon, before we go into that, I mean, and let's give people a little chance just to digest the peaks. There's a lot of information on there and a lot of dots, and they'll be searching for it. And it'd be interesting, Mark, to get your view actually. So you've been working in the EMEA region for a number of years now. Obviously, you started when you were very young, but you've been 20 odd years or so in the EMEA market. How have you seen the market change? I mean, there's names on here that probably are a lot bigger now than they were when you first started looking at its market. Some of the names have disappeared probably. So how have you seen the EMEA market change in recent years?
Yeah, you're right, Dave. I started when I was about 10 years of age, obviously.
Of course.
And so, clearly that's given me the experience I've got. But I think, honestly, it's really interesting. I think it's changed. There is definitely change, for sure. And there's a lot of things that haven't changed, honestly, when I kind of look at the peak report that we're just talking through there. I think there's no question, without a shadow of a doubt, the provider consolidation has been huge over the last 10, 20 years. Many have consolidated into larger providers. And actually, as a global or EMEA level client, we saw that as generally as a positive. So the provider landscape has really changed significantly over the last 20 years, for sure. But I still see several of the same bigger players there, and I think that's a good thing. I think it shows that they've stood the test of time, actually, and kudos to them that they've been able to do that. But definitely, there's been some positive supplier consolidation. I guess on the other hand, if that's, if I can share that, Dave, is that what I do see when I look at that, and when I read the recent CXM peak report that we're just going through here, there's a lot of the similar challenges, though, that are being experienced, of much the same as they were 5, 10, or 20 years ago. Things that we were always focused on. Things like the ability to operate consistently at a high level across all sites are still things that are being asked for and aren't always being provided by big players and less big players as well. The need for proactivity to drive improvements and to share best practices from the provider to the client and get more insights into assist decision making. That seems to be still something that we haven't quite got. And I guess ultimately it feels to me still that the provider who really nails this will differentiate themselves hugely. And that, I think, really is the issue, is differentiation. And that's true whether at the EMEA level or global level. I still think there's opportunity to differentiate from the providers to help them become strategic suppliers or providers to the buyers. So I guess that was my overall takeaway. I don't want to hog the thing. I can add to that, Dave, but my initial thought was, yes, definite change, but there's still some significant, I suppose, similarities to what I've seen over the last 5, 10, 20 years. And I think it does come down to differentiation, in my view.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point, Mark. And I think that we spoke about it. We met for lunch to prepare for this, and I think we chatted about the lack of differentiation in the market, and all of the service providers who may be on this LinkedIn have probably heard me say too many times that there isn't a lot of differentiation out there in the market. And actually, it's a struggle for service providers that we know they're all working through. But in a crowded market, everyone's talking about being more digital and driving digital transformation. It is hard to find that cut through, and we can come back to that. But
can I, Dave, can I just add just a teeny thing to that? Is that I think just on the differentiator, I think you're right. There's a lot of digital stuff and things like that need to happen, but there's still some fundamental basics that I think are really key, and I think that mustn't get lost. And I think that's we expect obviously good performance at all the sites, and I think many sites can do that, whichever the provider. That's often not the differentiator, but I think it's what can the provider bring to the client from their wider business, but also how strong is the relationship between the provider and the client as well. And I could see some of that coming through in the report. The strength of that, I think, is vital to kind of really underpin the trust between the provider and the buyer. And then you get more business through that, and you're happy to entrust more business with them as well. So I think that relationship is key. And I think that's maybe a key differentiator going forward.
And Mark, I just had a question. So, just today I was talking to someone, and they were telling how difficult it is to really operate in some countries compared to others due to different cultural requirements, language barriers. And I know we look at this market as a whole, we're looking at EMEA, but then this is such a heterogeneous market, right? There's Germany, there's France, there's so many smaller countries. So as in your experience, as you were trying to deliver that superior and consistent customer experience across the region, how much does that regional nuance or differentiation come into play?
So just make sure I got you. How much does that regional understanding and nuance play? Is that
yes.
It's vital, right? I mean, I think that's what you need from any key supplier that you're going to go with at an EMEA level, global level, whichever way you want to look at it. That understanding of the local business, from a national or regional level, is what you're after. is what you expect from that provider. That's kind of what you're paying for to some extent. You as a buyer don't want to necessarily be the one that's explaining to the provider, these are the challenges in that country. You're expecting that supplier stroke provider to know some of that stuff. That's their expertise they're bringing to the table, if that answers your question. So frankly, that was a key thing. Dave would recall that from our EMEA days as well. We expected that level of insight from an understanding and knowledge from the provider for them to bring to us.
Yeah, it's a great point, Mark. And I've just popped up a slide that actually comes from a recent report we've done, which actually looked at global providers, and it looked at the global 14 that could deliver across all three regions at scale. But one of the things that we saw there is a demand from global buyers in terms of understanding the regulatory compliance or the regional nuances, and that was from a global perspective, but it's equally applicable from just specifically from an EMEA perspective.
Completely. I saw this slide actually when I read through the report. I completely aligned to it. Exactly. It's exactly what we would be focused on.
Perfect. Well, it sounds like we're aligned, which means the lunch was well worth spending, Mark, for you to agree with me for once. So that's great. So just again for the audience, and encourage you, if you've got any questions, please use the chat. I haven't had any questions yet, so please drop a few questions in, and we can cover them. But
I've seen some great names on the list, by the way. Hi to lots of people that I recognise there, whether you're in Robin in Manila or David in stormy Florida. It's nice to see some names that I've not spoken to for a while.
Yeah, but they know where the skeletons are buried, Mark. So don't encourage them to ask questions. But no, so I think if we went back to the peak, I think it would be good just maybe Sharang, if you could just orientate us a little bit in terms of the peak, and then we can get into a bit more detail about some of the things that people we know or buyers are looking for from an EMEA perspective. But yeah, if you could just maybe orientate us to the peak.
Happy to do that, David. So what we did was we analyzed 20 plus service providers who are operating in the EMEA region, and just based on the methodologies that I just explained, we've classified them across 3 categories: aspirants, major contenders, and leaders. Now, what I just wanted to point out was that the market has really heated up in the last couple of years. What we're seeing is that there's a renewed push and interest from a lot of service providers. So what we've seen is that on one hand, there have been these regional behemoths that have been doing well for themselves in the market. They have that great understanding, and they have been continuing to invest and doubling down on their investments in the EMEA market. So some of the regional players like the likes of Webhelp, Majorel, Comdata, who are positioned as leaders here, I think they come from that foundation of having a strong presence in the EMEA market. And what we are also seeing is a lot of investment coming in from these players as well. So we've seen a number of acquisitions in the last 12 to 18 odd months. In fact, some of the examples are Majorel recently acquired this a Turkey-based player called Mayan. They acquired another player called IST Networks in Egypt. Similarly, Webhelp bought, and I'm sorry if I don't get this name right, Uti Blinkers in the Dutch market. And that's one side where what we're seeing is that some of the larger players are consolidating their position, trying to make sure that the different markets, the different countries that they're in, they can expand that presence. And then on the other hand, what we're also seeing is that some of the smaller players, some of the first-time entrants are also entering this market. For example, we saw a regional player, Raya, acquire Gulf CX. Then we've seen a lot of concerted efforts from some of the international players who are now trying to strengthen their position in the EMEA market, the likes of T-Tech, IGT Solutions. We've seen a number of investments coming in from these players as well to sort of capitalize on the opportunity. And I think, and we'll of course speak about that later as well. But why is there so much of renewed interest in this market? Is because I think Europe has finally awakened to the whole digital transformation. And probably, Mark, you can also share some perspective on it. But what we've seen is that before the pandemic, while there was some sort of a eagerness to get on the digital bandwagon, we were largely seeing that enterprises were still hesitant to actually get started on that journey. I think the pandemic has really acted as a fillip, and we're seeing a lot of eagerness from all different kinds of enterprises. The large ones, the multi-billion ones, even the smaller ones, those with 50 odd FTEs. All of them want to incorporate digital in their operations, and I think that's where they're reaching out to third-party service providers, some of which you see on the screen, to help them on this journey. So I think that's a monumental shift that we've seen in this CX market in the last 24 to 36 months.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rang. We've had a couple of really interesting questions come in as well. So, Mark, I do want to take you back to the differentiation point at some point. So don't let me forget that, because that's an area that I'm really interested in. But take a question from Katrina, which is actually really relevant to your background, Mark. There, but so while many seek global coverage, what's the maturity of actual buyers to adapt to manage global engagement? So I think from our time together, there was always that desire we wanted global providers to deliver globally, but are buyers ready to do that? What's your view?
Well, it's definitely, take a quick step back. First of all, it is really a key question, because too often, actually, as a buyer, so from working at Microsoft as a buyer, we do expect the providers to operate globally, but we can't expect if we're not able to operate globally ourselves. Now, we spent a lot of time putting in place global processes, global account management structures, and essentially global contracts. And there's a few people on this call that used to work in my team, now work in different places, but would remember the hard work we went into to make us move from, let's say, national to EMEA to a global organization. It takes a lot of work. You need a lot of processes and practices to be in place to do that. Once you've done that, then you really can then, I think, drive a global conversation with the supplier. And I think then that is very difficult for some global suppliers or providers, because then they really are having to operate globally when they say they can, but actually now we're expecting them to do so. But Katrina, I would say there's a lot of work to get to that stage. And I couldn't say I know whether the level of buyer readiness for that is. I think it really varies. I think a lot of buyers and big companies will say they're global, but they aren't really operating globally. They're kind of very siloed. But I equally would say, it may be kind of moving on to the provider perspective, my experience was there weren't that many providers that really could genuinely operate globally in a really strong way. And I think we sometimes at a Microsoft level, because we were operating globally, we're almost the worst nightmare, because we would be saying, no, we expect you to operate globally. So we expect you to be wired together at a global level. We expect you to have a global leader for our business. And we don't expect different silos across the geos and across the world. That would sometimes happen, and it would be a real challenge. I think things have moved on, but certainly, say some years ago, it was a big challenge, and a lot of global providers that said they were global didn't operate like that. So it's a tricky one, honestly, but I think you have to be ready to be able to do it yourselves as a buyer. And so I could bore you silly on this call, and Dave would stop me immediately, and the several people on the call would do it as well, to tell you about the stuff we put in place. But a lot of it is about rigorous processes and procedures to be able to operate globally in a consistent way, to be able then to expect the provider to be operating globally as well. Hopefully that makes some sense. Dave,
that's great, Mark, and I think you're right. I mean, I think we always ask, you got to act globally, but if you're not, then the holes become apparent very quickly. And I do just maybe being on the side of service providers a little bit more these days, I definitely think that there has been big steps made. I think the providers have really invested quite a lot in account management and actually realizing that global account teams are important. And at the end of the day, and we say this all the time, a lot of the time, all of the providers are very capable. It will come down to the account management team that you've got,
Correct.
the site
I
management
totally agree
team
with you, Dave.
that you've got.
Totally
And the
agree with
processes
you.
can be there, but if people are ignoring it, so a lot of time it comes down to the team, which we've said for many years anyway. So
Yes, yes, you have.
another question's come in from Gemma, who we both know really well from our time at Microsoft. But she's asking, how do we benchmark cost in our evaluation dimension? And I think, Shirang, basically I'll answer this and you can chime in, but we don't actually benchmark cost as a pure element within our benchmark, because I think that we know that cost is so driven by what are the business requirements that you're asking. So whether that's training, whether that's service level, whether that's whatever it is, that actually that's too, it's almost impossible to benchmark like for like. So we actually don't focus on cost. So what we try to do is educate the buyers in terms of who's got the capabilities and the delivery capabilities and is getting good feedback from their customers, and have they got a strategy and a vision. And then the pricing will come down to moving it on to RFP, because one of the things that we often say about the peak, and I'm very passionate about this, which is if you're looking to buy, you don't make a decision based on the peak. If you're looking to run a procurement activity, you can look at the peak and it will give you an indication of who you should be talking to. But no buyer is going to buy from a peak. You shouldn't be buying just because they're a leader or a major contender. You've got to see how that aligns to your own structure and your own culture and your own business requirements. So we don't specifically benchmark cost. We try to make it more around the elements that are consistent, and then cost will be driven by your own business requirements. So if we move on a bit now, so we touched on the peak. If we could bring back up the slides, one of the things that we've also seen is that the reason why this is important is that the Emea market is continuing to grow. And Shirang, I don't know if you just want to take maybe a minute or so just to orientate us in terms of the growth of the Emea market and what we're seeing.
Sure, Evan. So again, when we look at the absolute market size, and what we have here is on the left side, what we are trying to show is of the total global CXM spend or the outsourcing spend in the CXM market. I think 34% is attributed to the EMEA region. So this includes UK, continental Europe, as well as Middle East and Africa. So that's a rather huge chunk, and second only after North America. And what we've seen, and like I was just talking about, right, that the market was fairly growing at a happy pace before 2020, around 3 to 5%. But I think post 2020, there's been this increased awareness around the impact that outsourcing can create for enterprises. And I think a couple of reasons there why we've seen this huge surge. In fact, 2021 was probably the best year for CXM outsourcing in EMEA that we've seen almost in a decade or so. Like I was saying, there are a number of reasons why we're seeing this huge growth coming in, and primary ones being, of course, enterprises are realizing after the pandemic that they may not necessarily have all the necessary capabilities to handle something like this again in the future. We saw that there was a huge disruption in 2020 as well, as some of these services had to be halted. There were no BCP measures in place for most of the enterprises, and they realized that they don't necessarily have the time, the resources to get them in place, and it's just simply better to let the experts do their job, where third-party service providers come in and can provide that continuity in business. Then, like I said, we've seen an increased in awareness around the whole digital theme. Enterprises want to get on the digital bandwagon, but again, it's not simply like you just click a button and there you have it. So it requires a long roadmap, long strategy, with different kind of technologies that are there, the different kind of plans that are there, which is again something that requires a lot of experience. And given that service providers have been doing this for the last decade and more, I think that's where again they come in and bring that kind of expertise. The other reason is the whole talent crunch. Now, we've been hearing the term great resignation for a while now. And while it might have originated on the other side of Atlantic, but what we've seen is that it's largely turned into a global phenomenon where finding the right talent is becoming an issue, not just in Americas, but even in the EMEA market. And given that how difficult it can be to procure that kind of talent, I think what enterprises want is for the experts to do their job again, and that's another reason why we're seeing that kind of shift towards outsourcing. And final, but and still pretty important, I'd say, is the cost savings. Now we know what kind of a market we are right now in, and with the inflation and the cost pressures that most of the enterprises find themselves in, there's an increased focus on bringing down that cost, meanwhile not impact the customer experience. So it's not just about reducing the cost, it has to be done in a way that does not impact the overall the brand, the customer experience that the customers get. And I think that's where, again, service providers come in with the kind of flexibility they offer, the kind of scalability they offer, different kind of shoring mixes that they're able to provide based on what is the requirement. That's another reason why we see there's a huge preference to working with third-party service providers uh, in the EMEA region as well.
And Trang, I think we would also be wrong not to point out there is obviously a bit of COVID benefit in those numbers as well. So that the spend up from governments on track and trace, etc., has also increased those numbers as well. So there is a trend towards more outsourcing, definitely. But actually, there is also some bump there in terms of COVID, and which we saw in 2020 and the 2021 numbers, based on COVID, is stuck around for longer than anyone would have liked. So that's great, and I think that one of the things that we also wanted to talk about is, okay, so what are the differentiators that people are looking for when you're looking at global providers or European providers? And I think this slide really resonates. As I said, this is from our Global 14 report, which was looking at what global buyers are looking for, but I think it really resonates in the EMEA context as well. But we talk about the fact that you need that regional understanding, but you need the relationship, you need the ability to deliver globally as well. Mark, in terms of your experience, I mean, I think you mentioned earlier, but these all resonate, I think. And when you talked about differentiation,
Yep.
one of the things I was interested in that you mentioned was the differentiation might be in how they deliver and the account teams that they bring. But I know if we've got service providers on this call, they're going to be desperate to know. And I don't think there's an answer. If there was, I hopefully would have come up with it and I'll be making billions. But I think they're desperate to know how you differentiate in a sales position that your delivery is going to be better, because we've often joked that every provider tells you they've got the best coffee, the best agents, the best toilets, whatever it is, but they've always got the best. So what have you seen? What approaches have you seen, maybe? And I know we've not prepared this one, so apologies. But what approaches have you seen from providers in your experience who are trying to differentiate? They've got that different capability. Have you seen anything that would be interesting for this audience?
If I'm gathering your question enough, is what are the things that are differentiating the provider really in this sort of like landscape, right, Dave?
But how are they trying to get it across? Because I think one of the things that we often see is that they may have the best team, for example. Let's use that. They may have the best account management team, but just saying it doesn't necessarily convince an old cynical buyer like us that they do, because everyone's telling you that anyway. So how did you get under the covers? Was it site visits? How did you understand who's bringing that real thing?
It is a bit of that. I mean, it's a bit of several things. Certainly, it's the kick the tires thing, and it is the being close to the business. So I think there is the buyer going to the sites, actually seeing it actually in action and how it works. How do the team managers work? How does the message that the buyer has delivered to the provider in terms of this is what we want from the site? How has that really been delivered, and how has it flowed down to the agents, who are the crucial people? At the end of the day, they're the ones that are touching the customer. So has the messages that are all the fine visions that we all talk about at a global level, how is that really landing? So I think you can only see that sometimes by being at the site or being able to kind of listen to them live. So I think there's definitely that. I think, sort of, sorry to kind of hark back to the thing we mentioned at the start about that kind of engagement and relationship between the provider and the buyer, but that I think is so crucial in any environment, whether it's a sort of tumultuous environment like the economy is right now, and the worldwide issues that we have, or when it's fairly steady state. You need that strong relationship, and I think it puts an even higher emphasis on the provider having a strong person engaging with the buyer to really bring some of the best of what the provider is doing to the client, to the buyer, and say, this is what we're doing, this is how we're doing it, this is how we're being proactive. And it's really trying to think about the business that the buyer has, even though you're working for the provider, how would they be thinking, and really bringing that sort of mindset to it. And the more we saw of that, the more we saw that the provider was coming to us with ideas and suggestions and building up that sort of relationship, the more we felt confident that that was the right supplier to go with, and that, you know, there was that level of trust developing. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's certainly what I think we felt anyway.
Yeah, no, and it's really funny actually. So I did a LinkedIn live a couple of weeks ago from a leader of the sourcing team at DNB, the big Nordic bank, and this was more about IT sourcing. But actually, one of the things he was saying is relationships don't exist between organisations; they exist between people. And it's so true that it wasn't the relationship between the buyer and the service provider in terms of the companies, but it's the people that are in it. So it's a very people-driven business, and that's important.
To add to that, it's a two-way street, by the way. And I hope anyway that certainly from my teams, going from a buyer perspective, the provider, both sides need to work hard at that relationship. It shouldn't be a one-way street. Provider being great at relationships, the buyer needs to be making an effort too to build those relationships, to get those connections. And I think if they both are doing that, buyer and provider, that's when you start to get a really strong business, frankly. But you've got to have both working together.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I want to take a couple of questions just from the audience and encourage any more that you've got there. One from Ashish, which was around how is the location strategy evolving for clients in Europe? Is Eastern Europe still preferred as a nearshore local delivery, or is more local delivery more preferred? So, Mark, I know you did a lot of work in Eastern Europe in the past, and I know that places like Romania, Bulgaria were really popular in those days. But I know that, and Shirang, you may know the numbers off the top of your head, but I think that we saw during the pandemic, there was a bit more of a push back to onshore and local delivery. But there's now a slight move more back to more of a nearshore or offshore model. So what's your view on that? And what's your sense in terms of any emerging locations that we should be thinking about? I know there's been talk about Croatia as well as an additional locations, etc. But what's your thoughts?
Is that a question? Sorry, Dave. Is that a question?
To Shirang? Yeah, to Shirang, because he may know some of the data.
Yeah. He's the expert.
No, definitely. I think you made a valid point where in early 2020, we saw that given the unpreparedness for some of these offshore locations, we saw some movement back to onshore location and the preference there and so. But off late, what we've been seeing is with the talent pressures, with the cost pressures, there's an increased appetite for going back to some of these nearshore and offshore locations. And like it's said in the question, I think Eastern Europe remains the preferable location for nearshore work, and that's simply because it has that kind of language capability. There's still that kind of cultural affinity, and then people can provide those kind of similar levels of services that they can deliver out of onshore. So definitely, like you said, a couple of places like Bulgaria, Greece, Poland, Romania, they continue to be preferred locations, but we are also seeing upcoming locations such as those in Albania, Kosovo, in Eastern Europe as emerging locations. What we're also seeing is that another region or another area that's really coming up fast is the whole Middle East and Africa region. Now, traditionally, we've seen that parts or countries in Northern Africa, Morocco, Egypt have been used to deliver to Western Europe, so countries like France and UK. But we are also seeing a renewed interest in some of the other locations within African continent, and there's a lot of opportunity, right? When you look at countries like Madagascar, Nigeria, Ghana, what we're seeing is that there's an interest from both enterprises where they want to explore some of these new delivery locations and see what is it that these locations have to offer, as well as service providers who are always hungry to expand into new regions. What we're seeing is that some of these more mature sort of delivery locations in Eastern Europe, they are starting to get saturated, right? We've seen a lot of service providers and even GICs being set up in these locations, which is making it difficult to find new talent. So, in the hunt for next big location, I think Africa is where that compass is shifting to, and we're seeing those early baby steps. Probably in the next 3 to 5 years, we might actually see some of these countries start contributing to the whole delivery in Europe in a meaningful way.
Yeah, thanks. And I think it's interesting, and I think, Mark, I know you've got again experience in Eastern Europe, and I think the challenge from an EMEA perspective is that whilst Africa is a really attractive location, and I know, and I've done business out of places like Egypt where you can get French and you can get Spanish and you can get Italian, but when you start looking at some of the harder to find European languages like Dutch, etc., Swedish, it is quite hard to find. Now, you wouldn't find those in Africa. And then I think that's where people also look at things such as multilingual hubs to actually bring people into there, but also looking at technology to solve some of this problem as well. So some of the translation technologies that are out there for chats, but it is a really tough market to serve, as we started this whole LinkedIn Live with, because of the complexity of the language. But yeah, so to answer the question that was asked, I think there are some emerging locations as like Kosovo, Albania, Croatia, as Sharang had mentioned, and then the traditional ones are still staying quite strong.
Yeah, and I think the only other thing, just to add, obviously it's kind of an obvious thing, but if you're going to some of those emerging markets, you've got to also, I think, put even greater emphasis on BCP. You've got to make sure that that is in place. I know it's obvious, but worth stating, because you are taking a higher risk in an emerging market for various reasons. And so you've got to make sure that you've got ability to be able to flex and to adjust if necessary for completely unexpected reasons. But I think it's worth saying anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a great point, Mark. And I think that we often have said in the past that BCP was always there, but it was sometimes a little bit overlooked. And I think COVID really put a spotlight on BCP. And we now know that a lot of the buyers that we're talking to, BCP is and risk management in general is now one of their big priorities. I was talking to someone the other week and they were saying they used to be a sourcing and procurement person. Now they're who did a bit of risk. Now they're a risk person who does a bit of procurement and sourcing, because risk is their priority to manage. And moving into these locations, you do have to factor that all in.
Absolutely.
I want to get to a couple more questions, just because I think that the interaction is quite interesting, and just listening to us sometimes going on about what we want to say is less interesting. But there was a question from Sanjeev around, do we see net value creation, so top line, as a driver yet, or do we continue to see cost efficiencies as the key ask of buyers? And I can take a start and then you guys can jump in. But I do think that we are definitely seeing that buyers are looking for, well, it sounds really trite, but they are asking for both. I think there is definitely a look, and a lot of the buyers I talk to, it's about that value creation. How do you turn support or service into a value center versus a cost center? And I think that for 20 years, everyone's been trying to move away from being a cost center to be a value center. What will be interesting, and be interesting to get your view on this, both Mark and Sharang, which is we talk a little bit about the impact of the potential recession that could be coming in some Western countries. Obviously, let's not talk about the British pound right now and everything that's going on with our government, because that will be depressing for everybody who's living in the UK right now. But I think that there will be a focus on cost reduction still as we start to look at these tough economic times, but value is still going to be there, and people are looking at how do you get more out of the services that you offer. But Mark, Sharang, what's your thinking in terms of where I know you haven't got a crystal ball, but where do you feel the market could be going, and what change would that be? And Mark, you've probably lived through previous threats of recessions. I'm not saying you're that old, but not from the Second World War or anything. But
I remember in 1852, Dave, we had a problem.
Exactly. But no, but you've through different financial crises, and it changes the focus.
I figured we'd probably get a question on this. I was kind of thinking about it a little bit ahead of the call. But I mean, the truth is, yes, over the last 25 years working in the business, there has been recessionary issues. We've had major, the global financial crisis, or various things that hit different companies, Microsoft specifically, or for my sake, but other global things that hit the general economy. And I can see that absolutely as coming down the track right at us. And I think it's inevitable, honestly. I mean, if I put my kind of hat on that I was still running the business I was running, there will be cost pressures on all the buyers. It's inevitable. So it's kind of head in the sand if you don't think that's going to come, because it will do. There's no doubt there will be pressures on the budgets for most of the outsource businesses that are going to be working with the providers. So I think that's definitely something to expect. I think that for sure, Dave, I think what you were saying is it's sadly they're going to want both. It is going to be a case of there is going to be, we need, as I would say, efficiencies, but I think most people would say cost savings, but essentially there's going to be efficiencies needed to bring that overall cost down. But we do want that customer experience. So it's how do you balance it? Dare I say, going back to the original conversation we had right at the start, that's going to be really key, even more key, that the relationship between the supplier and the provider and the buyer is going to be crucial. So you can have those open conversations, ideally some proactivity from the providers, say, look, we know this is coming, here's what we can see. And to some extent, sometimes actually being comfortable from a provider perspective, say, you know what, we might see a reduction in our overall revenue here, but it's going to protect the business, because at the end of the day, we know that the buyer is under pressure. That needs that level of maturity from the provider, rather than sort of a defensive wall coming up, because that, I think, will lead to a problem. And obviously then there needs to be from the buyer side an understanding that the supplier is in business, right? So it's that balance. But it's without a doubt there's going to be pressure on the business to bring costs down. And I do think it's going to be about those differentiation things that we talked about. And actually the other thing that's obvious, but making sure that the businesses are really running really well. Because when there's pressure on, the obvious focus will be on where the lines of business that aren't functioning really well. So if you're a provider, this is definitely the time to make sure that the business is actually performing on target, because the microscope will be on that, if not.
Yeah, brilliant. Sarang, any input onto that as well?
No, definitely very valid points from Mark. And I think as we move into these difficult times, and especially the winter, we are expecting a difficult winter for the European region. I think the whole scalability and flexibility, that's going to be important as well, right? Because some of the agreements that service providers and enterprises have may not be valid anymore, given the kind of how things turn out. So I think it'll be important for both the buyers, like Mark said, and the service providers to be flexible, because at the end of the day, you have to think about the long-term picture, right? We have been in recessions in the past, and it's not like they're all doom and gloom. Eventually they pass, and then eventually we'll be back on the path of growth. So I think preserving those relationships, trying to show some flexibility and compassion, and making sure that while cost will be critical, I don't think that things like customer experience or some of the other parameters will be just thrown out of the window. So it'll be important to balance all those things and make sure that you survive through it together. That's going to be critical.
I agree with you.
Yeah, and I think it's funny, Mark, because one of the things that if I was sitting here doing a drinking game, every time you talk about relationship, and I know that's an important part, and I know that's important for you, and that's one of the things that you've always stood out as drive that relationship. But I think it really echoes to the audience that it is about the relationships that you build to get through tough times, and it's about we've said this even on Everest Group webinars. It's about also treating each other with the respect as well, and not pushing the service provider into a corner because you can, because actually that comes back to bite you as a buyer, and the same the other way around, and there's loyalty on both sides. And so we would really echo all the time that it's about the relationship and the loyalty you show each other. If you talk about a true partnership, not in the legal sense, but building that partnership with both interests in mind, so you both get a win-win, really, which again is cheesy. Mr. Minkus, who we both know, is talking about he'd like to join our drinking game of having a drink every time Mark says relationship, because
I'm sure, but
it's very early in Florida.
I totally agree. I mean, it is, and actually, I think you've mentioned the keyword partnership. Actually, I think, and does sound trite. It does sound a bit cliche, but honestly, I think if you get to that stage, you are going to achieve more. And I think you can have those difficult conversations. You know that both sides are trying to get a win. You're not trying to get one over on the other. You're trying to get to a successful outcome. So the reality is it needs to have that. You need to have that partnership. I've always believed that, if the buyer is a buyer, if you're under pressure and you keep asking, we need this, we need this, ultimately it goes on deaf ears. But if you basically have a relationship where there's a degree of trust, then you know that when you make that ask, that the provider is going to say, yeah, I'll do what I possibly can. I know you're not going to be saying this if it doesn't make sense, if it isn't important. It needs to work both ways. It's it seems obvious to me, but I think it's especially important when you're in times of crisis, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's what I was going to say, Mike. It seems obvious, but it often gets forgotten when people are under pressure. And actually, a lot of the time, senior leadership put people under pressure to say, well, go and get more savings. And I think that one of the things we've said, I do some sourcing and vendor management webinars. We talk about actually make your leadership aware that there are tough times coming in the business that you're in, and they should be aware. But actually, that way, then there's some expectations being set that there's going to have to be some give and take here, and it can't always be give or take. Just want to get to another question, and again, we're looking to wrap this up in about the next 5 or 10 minutes. So if you've got any burning questions, please get them in, and yeah, let's find a really hard one for Mark. But one of them is around how are leading service providers coping with the talent shortage in EMEA? And I think that I can take a stab, and then you guys can add in. But for me, I think there is an appetite to look at alternative staffing models. So we know that there's definitely been flexibility in the hybrid and work from home model, where people are realizing that they've got to start letting people work from home. We've seen in certain geos when forced back to the office has happened, attrition has spiked. So people are looking at that. We also know that people are looking at setting up hubs in smaller little centers. So they can actually, instead of getting people having to travel into one big contact center, they can have smaller locations and treat that more as a virtual workforce, because you can attract a bigger talent pool. So I think there's a lot of approaches that people are taking. Starting to assess gig is another one that we're seeing. So people are having to be creative. They're also looking at ways of how to get talented on board quicker. So they're using technology to bring people on board quicker. So identifying talent, trying to onboard them, because we know that you lose a lot of people when it's a long time in the hiring process. We've got a lot of research on this. So whoever's interested in this area, let us know. We're happy to provide more background on this. But Sharang, anything that I've not covered that you feel you'd want to add in terms of what providers are doing for talent?
Sure, David. I think beside the point that I talked about, some of the new areas that are being explored in regions in Africa, I think the other sort of important thing is there's a lot of emphasis on agent experience, and it works two ways, right? I mean, rather than trying to find new talent, you preserve the talent that you already have. Make sure that they feel happy in the environment that they're working in. What that does is, while on one end, it really stops that kind of attrition rates from bleeding. And then on the other, I think what we've also seen is that a happy agent leads to a happy customer. Typically, agents who feel gratified from their job, they tend to do better at their job, and that means that they're able to solve customer queries better, able to keep the customers happy, which all in all is a win-win for everyone involved here: the organization, the customer, and the agent. So I think some of those things around talent retention, talent upskilling, making sure that they drive gratification out of their work, that is going to be important as well.
Brilliant, thank you. So I think we're coming to the end. We've got no more questions. So unfortunately, we have not found one that we can stump Mark with. But yeah, I'll maybe come up with one. But no, I really appreciate the time today and everyone's input into this. I think that if you're interested in the CX topic, we do have a webinar coming up next week, which is looking at how organizations are delivering exceptional customer experience. Unfortunately, you have to listen to me again, but with another colleague, Chandak. But that will be much more of a webinar, and we'll be providing quite a lot of content in that session. So if you are interested, then please register for that. And we'll be covering, as say, what we're seeing in terms of industry trends, some of the challenges that CX leaders are facing, and also what they're doing about it. So what we're seeing the industry do to try and address some of the challenges. But Mark, I really appreciate your time today. I thank you for coming. Thank you for all the prep that we've done. It's been great to get your insights. I know our audience really value someone who's actually there and been doing it as a practitioner. And then we can back that up with the data and the research that we're seeing. So really thank you for your time. Thank you, Sharang, as well, as always, for knowing the data and having really valid points. Any last comments from yourselves in terms of before we wrap up and let the audience go?
No, just to say thank you for the opportunity to chat. It was a really good conversation, Dave. So thanks very much, and hi to the many folks I've seen on the comments list that I know, and some that maybe aren't on there as well. It's really great to see some names that I recognise. So good to hear that. See that you're all listening.
Brilliant, thanks, Sharang. Any last comments from you?
No, I think this was a great session and a lot of interesting questions. And of course, if anyone has any other questions that we were not able to answer through this medium, please reach out to us on LinkedIn directly. We'd be happy to take those on.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Have a good rest of your day, whatever time zone you're in. Hopefully see you soon.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.